What if the silence you're afraid of is actually the voice of God? Most people run from silence. We distract, scroll, fill the air with noise, anything to avoid being alone with our thoughts. But the truth is, darkness speaks. And it's not always the enemy. Sometimes silence isn't a test, it's a turning point. In today's episode of Silent Redemption, you'll discover why your quiet seasons might be sacred, not shameful. We'll walk through real stories, biblical wisdom, and proven tools like Brainspotting that reveal how to hear when nothing is being said. This is more than just a message. It's an invitation to shift how you see silence and how you hear God. And once you understand the language of stillness, you'll never feel abandoned in it again. Have you ever sat in a room full of silence and somehow it felt louder than any noise you've ever heard? That kind of silence doesn't just echo, it presses against your soul. It's in that space where silent redemption begins to unfold. Elijah once stood on a mountain expecting God in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. But instead God came in a gentle whisper, 1 Kings 19:12. What if silence isn't absence, but invitation? Now here's where it gets deeper. That stillness often shows up in moments of spiritual exhaustion, just when you're begging for clarity. But it's also where true spiritual healing begins. It's a sacred ground for emotional healing because you're forced to face yourself without distractions. People who've gone through trauma and deep grief often describe this exact moment as the start of their healing journey. Not because God shouted at them, but because He whispered through the silence. And while the world teaches us to fear the void, in the kingdom of heaven, that's where the most radical silent transformation happens. It's in that quiet where faith and redemption become real, not just theories. Someone may feel like giving up, but decides to fast, journal, or revisit the Psalms, and suddenly, that darkness starts to shift. That's what brainspotting and contemplative prayer can activate. Clarity without words. And maybe, just maybe, that still, quiet place is exactly where doubt begins to whisper. You're sitting there trying to pray, and suddenly that voice creeps in. Maybe this isn't working. Maybe God stopped listening. That's not your voice. That's the whisper of doubt. It usually comes in the quiet, disguised as logic. But don't forget, even Jesus in the wilderness heard whispers, Matthew 4. The enemy doesn't always roar. Sometimes he whispers like a friend. These thoughts often sound wise at first. Don't get your hopes up. God helps those who help themselves. But behind them is a slow erosion of your faith and redemption. That's how doubt works. It doesn't crash the door. It slowly picks the lock. In sessions of brainspotting, people are often shocked to realize how many of their spiritual beliefs are shaped by old emotional wounds. That's when true emotional healing can begin. If you found yourself pulling away from prayer, from the Bible, from stillness, you're not broken. You're being targeted. And recognizing that is already a form of spiritual awakening. So what do? You talk back, out loud, just like Jesus did. You write out scriptures on sticky notes. You declare truth even when you feel none. Because once you see the whisper for what it is, you're ready to light a fire it can't survive. Faith doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it's just a flicker. Barely there, but still burning. And that tiny flame? It's enough. The Bible says, "A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out." Isaiah 42:3. In moments of silence, that flicker becomes your anchor. It's the start of silent redemption, the quiet decision to believe again. That's why some people turn to journaling, fasting, or just sitting still with a verse on repeat. Not because they feel strong, but because they want to be. Practices like brainspotting or breath prayer help reconnect that fragile spark with something divine. And it's in that moment, right when you think nothing's happening, that the deepest spiritual healing begins. Not flashy, not loud, but steady. That's how inner peace is built. When the outer world feels chaotic, the only fire that matters is the one you protect inside. Faith and redemption grow slowly, like embers fed by intention. Maybe that's why so many redemption stories start in silence, when no one's looking, no one's clapping, and no answer seems to come. But something shifts, and before long, that inner flame becomes a wildfire that pushes back the dark, unless the silence returns with a different shape. She didn't hear God, not in church, not in prayer, not even in the tears she cried alone at night. But something kept her going. One verse on her fridge. "Be still and know that I am God." Psalm 46:10. That verse carried her through the silence. And 3 months later, without warning, came the breakthrough she never saw coming. That's the heartbeat of silent redemption. It often shows up without a sound. Another man shared how he lost his job, his marriage, and nearly his mind. No thunder, no angelic visit, just long, empty days and a worn Bible. But every time he opened it, a word seemed to stand out. Over time, he began writing those words down. Eventually, they formed the outline of his own redemption story, a guide he now shares with others going through trauma and faith. That's how quiet healing becomes contagious. These stories don't make headlines, but they change lives. They're the kind of moments that lead to real spiritual awakening, not because someone shouted on a stage, but because someone dared to believe alone. You might never get a spotlight, but you might get freedom. And when your silence turns into a testimony, your healing journey becomes someone else's roadmap. Which leads us to something most people never consider when the silence shows up again. Silence doesn't mean surrender, but how you respond to it will define your next chapter. The Bible says, "Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you." James 4:8. That's not just poetry, it's strategy. When everything goes quiet, you don't run away. You lean in. Start small. 1 verse a day, 2 minutes of stillness, or even a whispered, "I'm here, God." That's the beginning of spiritual healing. Some people use tools like brainspotting, focusing their thoughts on a calming point while letting emotions rise and settle. Others find power in walking prayers, writing down redemption stories, or keeping a gratitude list during dry seasons. The goal isn't noise, it's presence. These rhythms allow space for your healing journey to breathe. They invite inner peace, even if you don't feel anything at first. God often speaks loudest through what feels like silence. Your part is to stay at the door, knocking, trusting that it will open. Matthew 7:7. Don't stop praying. Don't stop showing up. Your consistency is your warfare. The silence isn't punishing you. It's preparing you. And if you've come this far, it might be because your silent transformation is already underway, waiting to be sealed by the final word of grace. So now the question is, what are you going to do with the silence? Will you keep running from it? Or will you sit with it long enough to finally hear what it's been trying to say? Because maybe, just maybe, your next breakthrough is buried in the quiet you've been avoiding. Let me ask you this. When was the last time you gave God a chance to speak without interrupting him? Leave a comment below and share. How has silence shaped your faith? What has it taught you about spiritual healing, faith and redemption, or even inner peace? If this episode stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell, and stay with us as we continue this healing journey together. One whisper at a time.